There was a division of American soldiers whose own commanding general decided they would fail before they ever fired a shot, and then sent them into the most brutal mountain fighting in Italy. When the impossible orders went wrong, he blamed the men instead of himself. This is the story of the 92nd Infantry Division, and it would take the United States more than 50 years to admit the truth of what they did. They were called the Buffalo Soldiers, and the name reached back through history. In the 1800s, the black cavalry regiments of the American West had been given that name, and the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division carried it forward with pride into the Second World War, wearing a black buffalo on a green patch on their shoulders. They were, in this war, something rare and something heavy with meaning. The 92nd was the only all-black infantry division to fight as a full division in combat in Europe. The whole weight of proving what black soldiers could do in the front lines of the ground war fell, in large part, on them. The division was brought back to life in the autumn of 1942 and gathered for training at a remote and isolated post out in the Arizona desert. Like every black unit of that era, it lived under the rules of a segregated army. The enlisted men were African American, drawn from every corner of the country. The officers above them were, for the most part, white. And many of those officers and the leadership above them carried into their command the same belief that ran through the whole institution, that these men, no matter how they trained, would not measure up when the shooting started. The soldiers trained for well over a year, preparing for a war that most of the country did not believe they were fit to fight, and then they were sent to Italy. But before we follow them into those mountains, you have to understand the single most important fact about what happened to the 92nd, because their story cannot be told honestly without it. The problem was not only the enemy in front of them. The problem was the man behind them, the general who led them, and what he had already decided about them before the first shot was ever fired. The division was commanded by a major general named Edward Almond. He was a Virginian, a graduate of a Southern military school, and he had been chosen for this command by the highest levels of the Army, who believed he would handle a difficult assignment well. But Almond brought with him a deep and open contempt for the very men he was supposed to lead. He did not believe black soldiers could fight, and the record suggests that even before the division shipped overseas, he had essentially already decided that any failure would be blamed on their supposed incompetence rather than on his own leadership or the conditions he put them in. Think about what that does to an army. Soldiers can feel whether their commander believes in them. And the men of the 92nd knew they could not help but know that the general leading them into battle expected them to break and was ready to point at them when things went wrong. That knowledge is corrosive. It eats at morale before a single bullet flies. These men were being asked to be brave for a leader who had already written them off. It was, in a sense, a setup, and they walked into it anyway. The first of the division's regiments reached Italy in the summer of 1944, coming ashore at Naples. In a small moment that says everything about what this meant to Black America, the African American soldiers already working in the service units on the docks stopped and cheered as they watched their brothers march down the gangplanks on their way to the front as fighting men, not as laborers or servants, but as soldiers going to fight. For men who had spent their whole lives being told where they could and could not go, the sight of Black Americans marching off to battle as equals was worth cheering for. The regiment went into combat that August, crossed a river under fire, and took the walled city of Lucca. By that autumn, the entire division was in the line, assigned to the American Fifth Army, holding the far western flank of the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula, along the Ligurian coast, and up into the mountains. The Fifth Army was an international patchwork of nationalities, badly in need of reinforcements, and the Buffalo Soldiers were a welcome addition to a stretched and exhausted front. They had finally arrived where they had spent years preparing to be. And what waited for them there was some of the hardest fighting of the entire war. And what mountains they were! The Germans had built their last great defensive wall of the war across the mountains of northern Italy, and the 92nd Infantry Division was ordered to break it. This was the ground they were given, some of the worst terrain any soldier faced in the entire war. It was called the Gothic Line. It stretched for nearly 200 miles across Italy, through the steep, rugged spine of the northern Apennine Mountains. The Germans had spent months turning those peaks into a fortress, with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests carved into the rock, minefields, barbed wire, and artillery ranged on every approach. To attack it, you had to climb. You had to go up narrow, exposed mountain trails, in the open, into interlocking fields of fire, against a dug-in enemy holding the high ground above you. And you had to do it in the worst possible weather. Torrential autumn rains turned the slopes to mud and misery. Freezing winter followed, with snow and ice on the high ground and men living in waterlogged holes carved into the mountainsides. The men of the 92nd were thrown against these positions again and again, ordered up those killing slopes by a command that gave them difficult objectives and often inadequate support. They fought with rifles and machine guns and mortars, hauling their heavy weapons up terrain so steep that simply climbing it while carrying a load was an ordeal before the enemy ever opened fire. They took terrible losses. Sometimes they gained ground. Sometimes they were thrown back down the mountain they had bled to climb. It was the kind of fighting that broke veteran units of every color and nationality, and the Gothic Line stopped some of the finest divisions the Allies had. This was not a place where success came easily to anyone. It was a meat grinder in the clouds, and the Buffalo Soldiers were fed into it over and over across the autumn and winter. It was in this brutal fighting, at Christmas of 1944, that one of these men performed an act of sacrifice so complete it is almost impossible to fully take in. His name was First Lieutenant John Fox, and he served as a forward observer, one of the men whose dangerous job was to go far ahead and call in artillery fire on the enemy. Fox and a small group were in the village of Somma Colonia when German troops, some of them disguised in civilian clothes, infiltrated and then overwhelmed the town in force. As the enemy poured in and his position was about to be overrun, Fox ordered the rest of his men to fall back to safety. He stayed. From his observation post, he began calling artillery down closer and closer to his own location to break up the German attack. Then he gave the order that no soldier ever wants to give. He called the artillery fire directly onto his own position, knowing exactly what it meant. When American forces later retook the ground, they found Lieutenant Fox's body in the rubble of that observation post, surrounded by the bodies of roughly 100 German soldiers his final barrage had killed. He had traded his own life to blunt the enemy advance and buy time for his comrades. The people of that Italian village would later raise a monument to him. Here the injustice becomes clear. After months of brutal fighting, when parts of the division faltered, the general who never believed in them did exactly what he had always intended. In the early months of 1945, some units of the 92nd gave way under heavy German pressure in the mountains. And it is important to be honest about that. There were failures, there were withdrawals, but the reasons were not the ones the command reached for. These were men who had been given rushed and inferior training. Thrown into some of the most difficult terrain of the war, sent up those slopes with too little support, and led by officers who had told them in 100 ways that they were expected to fail. White divisions had also been stopped cold by the Gothic Line. That was the nature of the ground. But when the 92nd struggled, the failure was not blamed on the terrain, or the tactics, or the leadership. It was blamed on the men and on their race. General Almond seized on the setbacks as confirmation of everything he already believed. Court-martials, demotions, and transfers came down on the soldiers. The division was pulled off the front line and handed menial second-class duties. Men who had assaulted fortified mountains with machine guns and mortars were reassigned to clear mines from towns that other units had already liberated. And after the war, Almond would use the 92nd as his evidence to advise the Army against ever using black soldiers in combat again. The prophecy he had made was one he had helped to cause, and then he pointed to the wreckage as proof he had been right all along. And yet, even inside that betrayal, the men of the 92nd kept proving in blood who they actually were. And no one proved it more completely than a young lieutenant from Wyoming named Vernon Baker. In April of 1945, in the final push to break the German line for good, Vernon Baker led an assault on a fortified German mountain stronghold, an old castle perched in the heights. In the course of that battle, over 2 days, Baker did something extraordinary. Moving almost alone through withering fire, he crawled up to enemy machine gun nests and destroyed them one after another, wiping out several German positions and killing the enemy soldiers manning them. When his company was ordered to withdraw, Baker stayed behind to cover the retreat of his men, and then, the following night, he voluntarily led a battalion advance straight through the enemy minefields toward the objective. For this, Vernon Baker was given the Distinguished Service Cross, a high honor, but not the highest, not the one his actions had clearly earned. That would have to wait a very long time, because in those same final weeks, the 92nd Infantry Division did the thing its own commander had insisted it could never do. In the last great offensive, the Buffalo Soldiers broke through the Gothic Line. They pushed up the coast, and at the end of April 1945, elements of the division liberated the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa. They were among the first Allied troops into Genoa. In that sector, German forces surrendered to this division, the division that had been written off before it began. The cost had been staggering. Of the roughly 13,000 men of the 92nd who saw combat, nearly 3,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. They had earned more than 200 silver stars and thousands of other decorations for bravery. They had bled as heavily as any division in Italy. But of all those thousands of men, and all that valor, not one had been given the nation's highest award. In an army that had already decided what they were, the Medal of Honor was simply not going to be given to a black soldier. And for half a century, it was not. For more than 50 years, the record sat exactly where the prejudice had left it. And then finally, near the end of the century, the United States government did something it had avoided for 2 generations. It went back and looked at the truth. In the 1990s, the Army commissioned a formal study to answer a simple damning question. Had racial discrimination denied black soldiers the Medal of Honor in the Second World War? The researchers examined the records, and they concluded that yes, it had. Not a single black serviceman had received the Medal of Honor for the entire war, and that absence was not because the valor was not there. It was because of the color of the men who had shown it. The study recommended that the wrong be corrected. And so, in 1997, in a ceremony at the White House, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black veterans of the Second World War. 2 of them were men of the 92nd Infantry Division. One was First Lieutenant John Fox, who had called the artillery down on his own position that Christmas in the mountains, honored at last, more than 50 years after his death. His widow stood in for him to receive it. And the other was Vernon Baker. Of all 7 men honored that day, Baker was the only one still alive to stand there and receive his medal in person. An old man now, he accepted the honor his country had withheld for half his lifetime, on behalf of himself and of every soldier of the 92nd who had not lived to see this day. When asked how he had endured the years of being told he was less, he gave an answer of quiet, devastating grace. "Give respect," he said, "before you expect it." The 92nd Infantry Division was disbanded at the end of 1945 and never brought back. Just a few years later, in 1948, the President ordered the desegregation of the entire American military, an order that the sacrifice and the record of units like the 92nd had helped to force into being. And even now, the country is still not finished bringing these men home. Some of the Buffalo soldiers who fell in those Italian mountains were never recovered, and to this day teams are still working to find them, to identify them, and to bury them at last with the honor they earned. In our own time, more than 80 years later, they are still being carried home. Condemned before they fought, the men of the 92nd Infantry Division were expected to fail. Instead, they fought through impossible conditions and proved their country wrong. That is the truth of the Buffalo Soldiers, and it deserves to be told. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered, subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more of these stories than you could ever imagine, and almost no one is telling them.